disrupted.
America that I fought for.
Weird thing to happen. Hello, one and all. Welcome to this edition of Kitz Corner. Hope you're having a fantastic day so far. So, there was a testimony that was released on social media by former investigative journalists of the CBC revealing how the CBC propagandized people and manipulate people during the pandemic. And it comes to no surprise, but it is incredibly interesting to hear someone who was in the business actually describing the business of scapegoating, manipulating, and propagandizing people, especially during the months of the pandemics and the months of the fear-mongering, that kind of basis of, demonizing people that were skeptics about COVID and looking into the information, looking at the medical research that doctors were presenting. Don't trust doctors, trust the media, because the media never gets things wrong. So this was part of the National Citizens Inquiry that has been investigating all these different stories about how propagandized people were during the pandemic, and they have done investigations and how the media and how the government has played into the to propaganda and basically the rights and wrongdoings of the pandemic, how the response was. So this is kind of a collaboration of different figures trying to investigate how the response of the pandemic correlates to the nation as a whole. Was it good? Was it bad? Looking into the factors of that. So that's why I bring up this. So this guy, Rodney Palmer, recap on propaganda used by Canadian mainstream news. Take a listen to what he's observed happening at CBC since 2020. Robert Palmer is an award-winning journalist who has worked for 20 years as a foreign correspondent for CTV News and investigative reporter for CBC Radio and Television. So he has a huge background in the broadcast industry, and he's about to reveal how the tactics of corporate media were used against people during the pandemic. Rather than informing people, was more pushing towards an agenda. And we know this a lot with the mainstream media in America. We know this a lot with the corporate media in the UK. But, of course, it happened here in Canada. Don't hear much of it, but I want to address a bit of it here. So this is kind of a recap of his whole testimony. You can watch the rest of it on Rumble, but here's a listen to this.
Testify about, the standard process of news gathering versus propaganda at the CBC, and I'm wondering if you can tell us about that this morning.
When COVID started, and I started noticing that it was extremely different. I was watching it very carefully as the news was trickling out of China. It hadn't come to Canada yet, but when they shut down Wuhan, I knew that it was very, very different. This was something that had not occurred before. I started noticing that something very different was happening at the CBC because I'm familiar with the process. I wanted to talk today specifically about the CBC, although what I'm about to say goes for most media, news media in Canada. But the CBC is very different. If you're the Toronto Star or CTV News or any private entity, Global News, and you want to publish something that maybe isn't true, or you want to take the position of a pharmaceutical company, you can do that. If you want to trick your viewers into believing something that isn't true, there's really nothing to stop them from doing that. However, the CBC is a public entity. We pay for it. It broadcasts on the public airwaves, and we expect them to tell us the truth because they've done it for 50 or 60 years. So what I started noticing was something very different. About a week, maybe two at the most, into the emergency, there was a story on the National by Adrian Arsenault, one of the greatest broadcasters we have, a national treasure. Adrian has a particular ability to appear to be discovering the facts in the moment, even if it's take 20. She can do it every time. She's a genius at what she does. But she turned this ability against us. I saw a piece on the 4th of April where she opens up and she's looking at her phone and she says, "What do you do if this happens?" Somebody sends you a family text, say it's your father, and he thinks that the virus was manufactured by China. This is on April 4th, 2020. And I thought, well, wait a minute. How do you know it wasn't manufactured in a lab in China? What evidence does the CBC have 20 days into this or 15 days into this that this was not manufactured in a lab? There was an assumption that she put forth instantly. And then she went to an expert guest who said, well, don't embarrass your father. You'll just push him away. You've got to bring him in and you've got to kind of convince him. And I thought, well, I'm a father. Who are you speaking to? You're telling my children not to believe their father. You're telling, and I have some expertise and some experience in this particular field. And I thought it was shocking that the CBC was trying to get in between me and my children.
So that was one of the big things that the CBC was trying to push in the days of the emergency. And a lot of news networks were doing this. You could see that NBC was doing it, and CNN, the States, were definitely repeating this, was trying to censor out family members. And this is kind of I would say almost kind of the maniacal way that the CBC was trying to do it, because they didn't go out front and be like, well, if your father just, posts an article on the family chat, then you got to call immediately a Russian or a misogynist or a racist or a bigoted, something like that. They didn't do that exactly, but they were leading up to that. Because you just saw there, and let me go back to it. Where's that thing here? So they did on the National, which is the CBC's big broadcast, their big news broadcast that they do every night. One of the segments was how to talk to your family about COVID-19 misinformation. And they've done a lot of these stories. They've done a lot of these stories about how to, get away from the conspiracy nuts, how to get away from people that are bringing up wrongful ideas that could hurt people. And rather than sitting down and talking about critical thinking and looking into things and doing research and backing your claims, which is what any fact checker, anyone, anywhere would tell you to do, the CBC, the CTV, CNN, NBC, ABC, all the corporate media statures told you to demonize your family members. They told you to go after your crazy lunatic family members that may have mentioned, oh my God, maybe it came from a laboratory. And try to demonize them the same way that Stephen Colbert tried to demonize Jon Stewart when he made that brilliant joke about how the fact that, ironically, the laboratory is named after the virus. Maybe that's something to look into. And if it is disinformation, then you would try to discredit it by bringing up evidence and having a discussion about it. But no, we didn't do that. We did not do that through the pandemic. We then silenced the people, increased the censorship, and then epitomized family member after family member who didn't go along with the agenda. That's what was happening. That was how you dealt with misinformation from your family. By people that were misinforming you. They were telling you to silence out your family members. That's how you talk to your family members, by silence them out, rather than actually have a humane discussion. So then it goes into this
particular field. And I thought it was shocking that the CBC was trying to get in between me and my children. I was astonished that this organization was put forth as an expert on how to not believe your father, but not embarrass him at the same time. So this, to me, had nothing to do with news gathering. 10 days later, after the CBC did that story, the Washington Post did some real journalism. They pointed out that the State Department cables...
Honestly, I'm kind of shocked that he said that out loud. The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, has lied and manipulated their own readers multiple times, actually got this one right. Because someone, I don't know who, apparently had the balls and integrity to actually investigate the claims that maybe there was a laboratory leak, maybe there was something to do with Fauci and gain-of-function research, because we know Fauci has done that for years. That was his claim to fame, was doing gain-of-function research in biolabs across the world. We know about that. But apparently in 2020, all that information just escaped us, just went away. And Fauci was crowned a hero. He was crowned a hero, same with Bill Gates. But we silenced out all the credible doctors and researchers and virologists that have been looking at this virus with criticism and actually looking at the scientific data analysis being presented to them. We silence those people out, but we hail media figures as heroes. That's the trusted journalism that we had for almost 3 years.
Were sent from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to Washington in 2018, warning about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it was unhygienic. And in particular, they said there was a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is January 2018. And there was 2 cables sent, and the reporter saw one of them. The first cable, which I obtained, he says, this is Josh Rogan from the Washington Post, warns that the lab's work on bat coronaviruses and their potential human transmission represented a risk of a new SARS-like pandemic. So not only at the moment when Adrian Arsenault was telling you don't believe your father if he thinks it came from a lab, it was not only probable that COVID came from the lab, but it had been predicted that it would happen 2 years prior by the US government. So how does Adrian Arsenault say it wasn't, and don't believe anyone, including your family? Flash forward a year, Vanity Fair magazine, which
all it takes is one paycheck and a sign of a pen. That's all it is. That is how easily manipulative the corporate journalism world is, including public broadcasters like the CBC, because it is state media. It's the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Same with the BBC. Same with any other outlet around the world. The reason that Pfizer and Boeing and Lockheed Martin do all these advertisements on television, it's not simply just advertising. They're buying the media so that they can manipulate the stories and push their agenda. Then they can use the reporters and the anchors as salespeople. They're basically selling you the agenda. They're selling you the fear. They're selling you the war. They're selling you vaccines. They're selling you the propaganda. That's all they are. They're salespeople. They're stenographers. They're just repeating talking points being told by them by the government bodies and the corporations that bought into the government bodies. And that is what happened during COVID. That's what's happening. It's still currently doing now, and it's been doing it for years, actually. But this is the first time in history that people actually really examined and put forward to the fact that the CBC was being compromised and journalism has went down the toilet because they've been easily duped and manipulated and bought out and bribed and propagandized to go along with this crazy agenda.
Which is known for its excellent investigative reporting, published an extremely long and exhaustive piece where all they did was go online and look at publicly available scientific papers going back about a decade. The first one in 2013 was by Shi Zhengli, who's the director of emerging infectious disease at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She's known as the Bat Lady, and this is not a derogatory term. Actually, her scientist friends started calling her that because there was an outbreak of a SARS-like respiratory virus in a mine, and the miners died very, very quickly. And she is documented to having gone to that mine, scraped the bat guano off the mine, and brought it to Wuhan to examine. In 2014, she began publishing about the coronavirus from Chinese bats. In 2015, there was another paper that Vanity Fair found where Shi Zhengli discussed successfully inserting a protein from this Chinese horseshoe bat virus into the SARS virus of 2002, creating a brand new infectious pathogen. 2015, this scientific paper was published. Vanity Fair.
Now, I just want to note, because I don't think it's in this video and I don't have it with me, unfortunately, but there was a moment in his testimony where he talked about the SARS outbreak that happened in Canada here. And I'm old enough to remember I was about maybe 8 years old when there was the lockdown, specifically in Toronto, because they were able to isolate the virus to contain it into that area. It started off in China, then came into Toronto, and then they locked down, part of Toronto down because of this containment. And they treated the virus. They went after and did targeted research and figured out who's the most vulnerable and targeted those people and tried to, figure out a way to isolate the virus so it only affected the certain individuals. And that was only for, a couple months? And then they did a rock concert and had millions of people show up to a rock concert benefit. Like, it shows the response. And that was 20 years ago. That was 2003. So, the response from 2003 on the SARS outbreak in Toronto compared to 20 years now with the COVID response, that is just immersively insane. Just to look at the details and the response of it. How in 2003, we were able to isolate the virus in containment in the Toronto area, the GTA, and literally have a rock concert months later. But yet with COVID, we had to isolate every single individual in their own homes, lock everything down. Businesses were destroyed. Livelihoods were ruined. We caused crisis after crisis with homelessness, with mental outbreaks, with suicide rates skyrocketing, drug and alcohol possession skyrocketing. We made the situation even worse, and we've done this for year after year. And still to this day, people are still trying to push more lockdowns. It's so amazing. And he talked about this in his testimony because he covered the 2003 SARS outbreak. And he even mentioned that it's amazing that 20 years ago, the response then compared to the response now, it just shows how backwards, upside down, insane, and how we elevated this for political and fear-mongering reasons and not focusing on the real issue of protecting people.
Found it online. CBC could have found it, but they were too busy telling you don't trust anyone who believes this. In 2019, there was a paper actually published by one of the lab directors at Wuhan outlining the safety deficiencies in the Wuhan lab where he worked. And in 2019, right around the time that the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing was warning Washington about a potential SARS-like pandemic leaking out of this unhygienic lab, a number of the Wuhan lab scientists published a paper together describing genetically engineered rats that they had grown with humanized lungs and developed them in the Wuhan lab. So this is a pretty hot smoking gun coming out of the Wuhan lab. There are 3 labs in the world working on coronavirus, according to the Vanity Fair investigation. 2 of them are in the United States, 1 of them's in Wuhan. If this thing started at a wet market outside the Wuhan lab, it was because one of the staff members of the Wuhan lab walked into the wet market and brought it there. That is the most likely scenario. Now flash forward to this month, March 2023. U.S. FBI Chief Christopher Wray says the China lab leak was most likely. The quote is, "The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident." So the CBC had no evidence that it wasn't. They wanted you to believe that it wasn't. There's a definition of news gathering, and you'll see, interestingly, that news gathering is one word in the English language. It's not 2 words as it appears that it should be. And that's because it's very specific. It's the process of doing research on news items, especially ones that will be broadcast on television or printed in a newspaper. Now, how much research was done by the CBC to determine 10 days after the emergency that it didn't happen in a lab. Another definition here is propaganda. Persuasive mass communication that filters and frames the issues of the day in a way that strongly favors particular interests, usually those of a government or a corporation. Also, the intentional manipulation of public opinion through lies and half-truths and the selective retelling of history. This is what was going on.
I think that's on the placard outside all the corporate media buildings. I'm sure that people working at Comcast or CNN go by and tap it like Notre Dame. Like, that's us, guys. That's what we got to do. Persuade the masses. Because basically they're selling you stories. They're not informing you. They're selling you. And how primetime news channels, especially the ones you see like with Anderson Cooper or Aaron Burnett or Chris Hayes, Lawrence O'Donnell, Rachel Maddow, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, like those names, there's a reason they're household names. And I give a little bit of credit to our media system because we don't try to purposely perpetrate people to becoming these, well-known household names. I think if you turn on CTV News Channel at night, there's not going to be a primetime show. It's just going to be whatever the news is of the day, just on repeat. So that it just goes to show you how the news media functions and operates, and how it's lost touch with actual informative investigative journalism like news gathering, which is what I'm doing. And I'm not a journalist. I'm not a self-proclaimed, visionary. I don't have a $30,000 studio. I'm just doing a podcast in my basement. I'm doing the research. I'm looking at stories. I'm gathering information to tell to you, versus propaganda, which is just selling you a story that someone told me through the masses. And usually strongly in favor of their advertisers or the government or whoever is subsidizing them this week. So, and to come from an actual journalist who's been in that business, it definitely says a lot and definitely confirms all this.
In that piece. That's why it felt so wrong to me, because there was no news involved. There was only propaganda. What the Washington Post did with its lab leak theory story 10 days after the CBC said it wasn't from the lab was news gathering. It was investigative reporting. What the CBC did when it said don't trust your family if they think it came from a lab, that's propaganda. That's the difference in the definition of those two things. The Vanity Fair piece, reviewing scientific publications for a decade and uncovering the fact that human lungs were engineered on rats in Wuhan lab in 2019, just before the outbreak, is news gathering. Exceptional news gathering. I'm jealous of how good that news gathering was. What the BBC did, reporting on the FBI, saying they've known for a long time that it came from the lab, was news gathering. That's kind of news of the day, daily news. They said it, we're telling you they said it. What the CBC did by warning Canadians not to trust their fathers about a lab leak theory was propaganda.
So there you go. That was a former journalist, an investigative journalist who's been in the business for 20 years, explain the details and the manipulation of that business. The differences between someone actually gathering the news to inform you and someone just propagandizing you for business. And what the CBC was doing, especially when it came to the lab leak theory, was doing the exact same thing that Stephen Colbert did, the exact same thing that NBC News did, and MSNBC and CNN. They discredit everything, any information that was given to them, and trying to push the agenda that it was natural, it came from a wet market, even though there was evidence and proof of evidence that this this virus was highly suspected of coming from a laboratory, considering the laboratory is also named after the virus. And just like the Jon Stewart joke that he made on Stephen Colbert, and Stephen Colbert shot it down because Stephen Colbert is a propagandist. Jon Stewart was actually making excellent points as a joke. But Stephen Colbert, rather than listening to the points and trying to have a rational argument to it, he's immediately going to shut it down and say that you don't trust him, or you're part of the right-wing organization, or you must be a Nazi, you must be scumbag, you're a Trumpist. The exact same thing that CBC has been doing through this pandemic. And here's, when they say, how to deal with misinformation, where's that thing there? How to talk to your family about misinformation. One of the lessons you should be teaching, and I really wish people, I encourage people to take this because I know I took many courses on this, is media literacy. That was one of the greatest courses I have ever took in my life. I really got massive education boost from that. I think people need to be media aware and literate to the point that they're skeptical of the things that they're watching. Do not take the news for granted. Do not just go with the flow. Do not just take things at the scene of an eye. You have to become your own investigator. You have to become your own journalist, especially when the journalist is turning out propaganda. It now comes down to you. That's why I have a podcast. That's why you're doing your own information. And that's why the New York Times is telling you not to read into your own information. The New York Times telling its own readers not to read. So, and then he also goes on to this. So this is how the CBC also lied to people. We heard about the lab leak, but this is how they lied to people about ivermectin. And we know about ivermectin because we did research on ivermectin. We listened to what Joe Rogan said. We listened to what doctors have said. Dr. Robert Malone has said about ivermectin. We know that ivermectin is not horse paste. It is used to treat animals, but it is made for human consumption and is one of the top essential drugs of the World Health Organization because we did our own research. But this is what he said the CBC did.
There is definitely an agenda being pushed forth, particularly about COVID. It really hit me in the face when the ivermectin story was getting reported. So there was a doctor who named Daniel Negasay from British Columbia who was on an emergency locum. So his job is to go, and he was helping out the Alberta Health Services where they've got a town with maybe one doctor. The guy needs a vacation. So he comes in, runs the emergency room for 2-3 weeks. And he comes across 3 patients who are declining, so say the charts, from COVID. And he decides he's going to try ivermectin because he's read a lot about how it's working in other places around the world, including the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, which has a population of over 250 million people who reduced their COVID death rate to 0 in August of 2021 by issuing ivermectin. So he knows.
Dramatically reduced their COVID deaths by the use of ivermectin. You would think that a news organization like CNN and the thousands of employees that they have there would maybe mention this article and try to actually inform people that there might be an advantage to this, instead of taking the time and energy to manipulate a Joe Rogan Instagram video and change the skin color. You think they would take the time and energy to maybe mention that one factoid? Hey, by the way, there was a study done on ivermectin and it dramatically actually reduced the death rates. That would be something a journalist would do. That would be something I would do. I'm not a journalist, but that's information that someone could use. That's news gathering. So, of course, they're propagandizing people to push an agenda. And the reason they're doing it is because they don't want ivermectin to be popping out on the shelves because it's a generic drug and doing all this great, wonderful work. They rather push for big pharmaceuticals. They want Pfizer. They want Moderna. Because who's paying the bills? Who's paying the news anchors to promote this? Pfizer and Moderna are buying advertising.
That there's no side effects, there's no danger, there's no death. The worst case scenario is nothing happens. So he gives it to them, and they all get better. One of them was 90 years old and was transferred back to his nursing home. The CBC, and then he talked about it. So that was his crime. And the CBC did a hit job on the guy, saying this doctor is going to be removed from Alberta Health Services because he gave misinformation on social media. This is like an F1 button, misinformation on social media, misinformation on social media. It's what they call anything that doesn't fit the narrative. So I couldn't quite believe that they'd done this, because the story is not misinformation on the story of social media. The story is a doctor cured COVID with a pill that costs a nickel. What am I doing locked out of my hockey rink? What am I doing locked out of my restaurant? What are my friends? I have multiple friends in my town who own restaurants. What are they doing losing their shirts anymore when this guy has demonstrated an antidote?
That's the big thing. That is the big thing, is that they were trying to hide this away because, again, big pharmaceuticals will not profiteer from the destruction and chaos of the pandemic if they realize that doctors and nurses, because we showed you another story of a nurse doing the exact same thing. That nurse got fired for disobeying hospital administration orders, but cured her patients. And nobody thanked her for curing patients and making them better from this respiratory illness. They fired her for doing her job correctly, because big pharmaceuticals would not get a big check out of that. And they use the media, they use governments, they use hospital administrations, they use corporations, everything at their disposal to do this kind of lucrative insanity and push and motivate this agenda. Why the CBC did that, and why they're going after people on social media promoting misinformation when they're physically telling you and highlighting, and anyone can go on the internet and fact check and look at the data themselves. That's why they're telling people not to read what they see on the internet, and not have a skeptical thought, not have critical thinking. Just go with the flow and deal with it. That's what they told people. And that's what this 20-year journalist is informing people, that the CBC is purposely propagandizing you and manipulating you, because they have been compromised by the corporate estate, by the corrupted government, by the big pharmaceutical industry. They all play a part in this. And it leads to stories like this. I know this is from CTV News, but I just want to show you how it's still continuing on to this day. So CTV News also pulled a CBC, type like article out of their ass when they said how to help your kids spot COVID-19 misinformation. I got a simple solution. It's called critical thinking. But they're going to tell you that you should not listen to other people. You should not trust doctors. Doctors can also spread misinformation. That's why you have to go to a big corporation that has never profiteered off of lies and conspiracies. You need to trust them more than ever. Trust the individuals that fly over to Davos and make decisions based off your behalf. That's what people at CTV would be telling you that. Or how about this? This is from the CBC themselves. Still continuing on this. Canada not immune to the virus of COVID-19 conspiracies. So they're equating people talking about the virus as a conspiracy virus. They're saying that this is a mind virus. That people having doubts, having their own perspectives on the virus is more deadly than the actual medical situation, which nobody knew at the time, including myself, which is why at the start I fell into this trap. until I got vaccine injured with the second shot, and I looked into it and realized there's a lot more to this that people need to be aware of, including myself. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because they continue on by doing this. This is just recently, actually. This is from May 31st, 2023. So today, the CBC says this: mass boosters and self-isolation aren't behind us yet. So rather than correcting the wrong and telling their viewers and telling their readers that they were misinformed, rather than correcting the wrongs, they're going to double down on the insanity even more. Experts want support for high-risk residents as virus can lead to severe illness. I love how in 2023, we are now proposing the idea of the Barrington Declaration, which is the medical construct of targeting. You're targeting your response to the certain vulnerable people that are in need of this critical response. The people that are most vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus, you target towards them and you help those people. You don't do a general lockdown for every other person that is not affected by this. And what's even more hilarious is when you go into the article, the CBC discredits themselves in their own reporting. The CBC discredits themselves in their own reporting. Because when people actually read the article, this is what it says: nearly 4 weeks after the World Health Organization declared the emergency phase of the pandemic over, and just over 3 years since the pandemic started, SARS-CoV-2 has faded from the headlines and even from small talk. But Dr. Vera Etches, Ottawa's medical officer of health, the woman who led the city's public health response since the first lockdown in 2020, isn't ready to declare the pandemic over. COVID-19 has not disappeared. It is still with us, Etches said in an interview with the CBC's Omar. I don't even know how to pronounce that last name. I'm not even going to try. CBC's Omar, Tuesday. We're in a more stable situation where we're not seeing the same serious outcomes. So, basically, in layman's terms, the CBC just discredited the fact that this is not a serious response by quoting that the World Health Organization is not declaring this an emergency phase anymore. And their own trusted expert is saying that it's not a serious outcome. It's not serious anymore. It's not a serious situation. So why in the headline are you declaring that we need more lockdowns? We need more vaccines and masks? Because it's propaganda. And that's how they drew you in. They drew you in with the headlines, and then the truth somehow gets in there, but you have to look under page 85 upside down with a magnifying glass to realize that this story is completely false. And that is how you deal with misinformation. That is what you should be telling your kids. They need to read more. They need to look at the story. Check who the author is. Check where the headline comes from. Do a little fact checking of yourself. Don't go with the flow and discredit people just off whims and assumptions. Because you know what they say about assumptions. It makes an ass out of you and me. Because the CBC even discredits themselves in their own article. That's how easy it is to really find the news and really be informed of yourself. It just takes a bit of work and not listening to the propagandists smearing you otherwise.